the project, an FWO-funded project titled Housing and Refugee Inclusion, right? And so the question was, what is housing within this context of refugee inclusion? And this diagram on the screen is like the beginning point of the problematic of the research. And so this is a diagram based on the context of Belgium, where these two concepts operate on two different scales. So on the federal level and the national level, asylum procedures are grounded there, and they are led by federal authorities. And within them, there are multiple spaces that may loosely be considered housing, where people are housed within their processes of asylum. So these range from initial reception centers to asylum centers where people may stay a little bit longer. Sometimes there are centers that are between the federal level and local governments, called local reception initiatives. And also there are really carceral prison-like conditions of detention centers that prepare people for deportation. So all of this happens or is organized through the federal level. And then there's a very rigid divide between these spaces and broader housing processes in the city. And this divide in the context of Belgium is connected to the fact that even in the case that asylum seekers are accepted as refugees, they are given 2 to 3 months to figure out their own housing within the city or within the urban context. And so there is a moment of expulsion or an eviction into the urban space, and then having to figure out and navigate housing systems that are challenging because there's a huge limited capacity for social housing to accommodate people, which we would think is the most affordable form of housing in cities. And so only 6% of the housing stock in Brussels is social housing. And the requirements to be eligible for such housing requires like long residency within certain municipalities, but it requires forms of documentation that newly arrived refugees may not have. And the waiting list, even for citizens, are so long it can extend to years before you can be accepted. On the other hand, there is the private rental housing market, which also has high thresholds for newcomers. And so 80% of low-income groups pay more than 30% of their income in housing for rent, and that's highly problematic in the sense that people spend a lot of money just to house themselves, and particularly low-income groups, that percentage within their total income is higher. And so it's still very hard to transition into a housing market, but you're pushed into it. So this was the starting kind of point for the research. What does housing mean within this context really? How are refugees in particular, and broadly people who are in these processes of refugee and asylum and maybe even undocumentedness, navigate this broader system? And very quickly, this very neatly organized diagram, upon little scrutiny, became a lot more messy. Because these trajectories are not as linear as they're presented within legal notions of asylum and migration. People experience multiple and fragmented experiences of this line and trajectory, and they navigate multiple and different geographies as they do so. And often it doesn't start by arriving into the federal level or the national context. Often these processes begin from places where people are displaced from, what pushed them to move to begin with, what happens on the journey, and then how they confront the border, not just at the border, but sometimes even before that. And they also confront it within the national context, the different urban context, and within the spaces of the city. And so upon arrival, these asylum processes are also not linear. Sometimes people move from being undocumented to an asylum seeker, so maybe their processes is rejected, so they become undocumented again, and then they launch an appeal, and then now they're asylum seekers again. And so it's not, people move in between these categories very frequently. Sometimes pushed by the system to do so, and other times because they choose not to engage with these legal processes. Maybe they want to move further to somewhere else and they don't want to engage with the system. but this is a space where they are going to be working for a while to save some money, and they exist in the urban regardless. And so these nuances are very important. And so the urban space, or the broader notion of arrival neighborhoods or arrival spaces, become important because they're spaces where people navigate this existence in the city with precarious legal status. And it also connects them to transnational networks, possibly of solidarity, of communities back home, of similar communities in a different context. So that it's not just fixed in the local fixity, but there are also transnational movements that can happen within spatial fixity. And there's always also the threat of deportation, return. There are notions of waiting that extends so long that may even involve like huge parts of people's lives. There are notions of borrowed time when people are, for example, under threat of being deported, so it feels like the time that they're spending now is borrowed from a future that is uncertain. And so temporalities of these processes are also a very important dimension that needs to be considered, because without a temporal dimension, our conceptions of home will not be accurate to match the conditions that people are living in and working. So all of this messy diagram kind of created the need to take a step back and then to reframe the question of housing for refugee inclusion, right? And so it creates a lot of questions around mobility, borders, and the production of subjectivities. So asylum seeker, refugee, undocumented migrant are all legal terms that, based on the legal status of a person, assign certain or removes certain protections and the access to some civic rights or a right to participation or a right to the city. And so where do they really come from is a good question to ask. How are these subjectivities produced? And how are they constructed in a way to shape people's lives based on this term and a category? And these terms and categories, like I just argued, are fluid in the sense that people do move in between them, and they don't immediately tell us much about people's living conditions, about their intentions, and about their agentic powers within the urban space. And so, to reframe this, it becomes important to connect again to the broader European border as a project, bordering as an active thing that happens in the city, that brings these categories onto people, right? And so, a lot of theorists argue that the European border is at once externalized, and so the European border does not sit at the border of Europe anymore, but it's pushed even further into other countries through a lot of deals and negotiations that effectively ask the governments of these countries to stop movement towards Europe, to detain people even before they arrive at the European border, so such as the Turkey deal, the Rabat process, even the Khartoum process. So it's really going even further into the depths of East Africa, for example, where I'm from, and where these processes create these policing collaborations between nation states that already criminalize people beyond the European border in contexts far, far from it. Second, it's also internalized. So it's not just externalized, but it's also internalized, not just at the level of nation state, but also at the level of the city. And so this internalization shows itself in kind of racialized policing practices. It shows itself in even people, normal, ordinary citizens, like say service providers, say healthcare professionals, say landlords, find themselves in a position where they're required to also police people who come in contact with them who don't have certain legal status, right? And so even within the city, there are clear bordering practices that tries to reinforce this criminalization and then to reject people from the urban. So the border no longer becomes a line and a checkpoint that you cross through, but it becomes something that extends through vast geographies and vast spaces. And to be able to critique such bordering practices, it becomes important to understand where they're coming from. And so remembering histories of coloniality and imperial presence is integral to that. Why? Because especially within the context of Europe, a lot of the colonial empires that existed within Europe suddenly kind of reframe themselves as national contexts that are independent and separate from these colonial histories of extraction and exploitation. And so suddenly the consequences of these processes of impoverishment elsewhere in the world become an attack, a threat, a thing that is coming into Europe, that threatens European harmony, right? It threatens something, right? And so how do we not start the story from the moment where people are moving towards Europe, but we actually take it back to the reasons and the histories that connect the heart of the European empire to what was considered a part of it and was claimed by Europeans as a part of it. And suddenly, these former colonial subjects are considered a threat to the European imperial core. And so these contextualizing migrations within this context of colonial histories, but also racial capitalism and how the accumulation of power and resources by Europe and generally the West, also a similar context would be explained in the US or in different contexts, helps us contextualize it and helps us tell a story of a historical responsibility towards people, rather than a humanitarian generosity of Europeans when they accept certain refugees and then reject others. And rather than accepting without problematizing it, this notion that we're protecting ourselves from these migrants who are coming in, right? A lot of theorists in this context can create this idea of migration asylum nexus, where there are within this humanitarian notion, the idea of this is not recent. There was a time when Europe was claiming to be like champions of human rights and all of that. And so they frame this idea of becoming a humanitarian savior, a divide between people who are seen as deserving and undeserving. And so certain people who experience forced migration, who are escaping actual wars and contexts of conflict, can be put within this box of humanitarianism, and that adds this idea of benevolent Europe, right? Whereas others, usually economic migrants who are moving because of other forms of disposition that has caused them to move, are considered undeserving, people who are opportunistic, who are trying to get with the welfare state of Europe and gain its benefits, right? And so this divide obscures the connected roots of both displacements. And so by creating this migration asylum nexus and understanding that, especially as the world becomes much more precarious and much more interconnected, it's very hard to create a clear divide between forced and optional migration. Like all of these things are very connected, and it's very hard to draw a line. Where does the coercion begin is a good question to ask. Who is coerced and why are they coerced and how are these people not coerced also, right? And so this helps us blur the lines between these forms of migrations. Additionally, and I just mentioned the notion of welfare, when the nation states were formulated in the context of Europe, some of these contexts were still colonial empires, right? And so people within previous colonies were moving into the colonial core at times, right? And so the welfare state was quickly challenged by, especially in the 60s, a lot of labor migrations happened into Europe, especially from places like Morocco and Turkey, and also southern European states like Spain and Italy, where a lot of workers were brought into Western Europe and different parts through agreements. And that also coincided by a moment of like a crisis in the welfare state. And this highlights how this notion of like who is a citizen, who's not, who's a migrant, kind of is at the root of this notion of citizenship itself. And so like who's entitled to welfare and who is not is an internal kind of struggle within the notion of the welfare state itself. And so by the 80s and then later the 2000s and 2008 financial crisis, the welfare states are withdrawing even further and neoliberalism is taking over. This notion of welfare nationalism, or the idea that welfare is for citizens, nationals, and protecting it against outsiders, becomes even more pressing. And it now, I believe it's like the main debate across the West. It's the thing that elects governments and jobs governments. This notion of like migrants coming in, are they taking our jobs, are they taking our resources, and so forth. And so a lot of theorists actually challenge notions of welfare nationalism based on similar arguments to the ones I established before. But they also argue that this idea that the nation state is connected to welfare really hides the reality that there are so many people, like the migrants of the 1970s who were later not migrants, who have built these economies themselves, right? Today it could also be extended to how some informal, irregular migration is allowed so that the labor of these people can be exploited more easily, where people can come and work in the fields and do the domestic work and do all of these types of work, but they're constantly threatened, and so you can exploit their labor easier, and you can maybe not pay them. There are a lot of stories where people take the labor of undocumented migrants and then just call the border police, and you don't have to pay anymore, and so forth. And so a lot of theorists make parallels between that, between the precarious migrations of today and the undocumented migrated situation, and also the labor migrations of decades ago. And so, coming back to the urban, and coming back to the diagram that I've shown you earlier, while people are navigating all of these systems at the same time, it is not just the reception centers on the one side and then the regional housing options on the other. They are the only housing options available to people. And what points us to that is to recognize displaced people as having agency over also producing specialities that work for them, right? And so you can see things like squatting practices all across different European cities. You see things like infrastructures of hospitality, which may be, for example, sociocultural organizations that create a safe space for displaced people, sometimes also connected to housing. You can see things like hosting networks where citizens organize to host displaced people into their own homes. But you also see practices, I don't want this to be seen only as like positive liberatory practices, because there are also practices in the private rental market where exploitative landlords include undocumented migrants into the private rental market, but through exploitative means. There are also contexts where infrastructures that address homelessness for citizens in the city also are extended to displaced people as well and are included within them. And Brussels is one of these cases because the local government of Brussels includes undocumented migrants within their homelessness response. And so for me, I follow what Darling argues or theorizes, this idea of seeing asylum like a city, which is kind of an iteration of what Amin and Drift argue, this notion of seeing like a city as a way to transcend the national borders and the nation state, to go into the city context and see how these are influenced by the urban dynamics and the bordering practices in the city, in the case of seeing asylum like a city. So Darling argues that discussions have overlooked how the conditions of urban life shape refugee experiences, and how cities in their politics are reworked not just by the presence of refugees, but by the presence of claims to authority, sovereignty, and governance. that come with attempts to order mobility at different spatial scales. And so from this last notion of like ordering mobility at different spatial scales, it becomes important to see the urban as a container where dynamics that may be international with the externalization of the border, and dynamics that may be very local, and dynamics that may be national, all kind of blend into this urban space because all of these actors do exist there and are embedded in it in some way or another. And so we can look at displaced housing struggles and these formations of displaced geographies, like the ones that I showed on the diagram earlier, as at the intersection of, on the one hand, the bordering, the securitization, the racialization of the border regimes, and then on the other hand, all of the forces of neoliberal urbanism, like urban speculation, housing financialization, and gentrification. So the things that were on the part of the regional housing issues also impact displaced people, but the bordering also impacts them, and to access housing, they have to navigate both, and to be able to address both simultaneously. And so, trying to recap all of this a bit, within these displaced housing struggles, there's this notion of challenging displaced objectivities, which I spoke about earlier. And so this idea of legal categorization and how it's not accurate but it's produced and created by the border regime also highlights another important factor, which is displacement in itself is not an exceptional experience that we should place against like a stable non-migrant other. Because people in their conditions of being citizens in the urban are displaced as well due to processes of neoliberal urbanism and racialization and more. And so the idea that we have to challenge the scripts of the spectrum of like asylum seekers, and then there are maybe doubly protocol asylum seekers who cannot apply for asylum yet because they would be moved back to other European countries deemed to be responsible for them. And then there are transit migrants who maybe are passing through but not necessarily staying within an urban context. There are undocumented migrants, there are refugees, but there are also housing insecure citizens and residents who share similar experiences of displacement. And so the idea of broadening our understanding of displacement and the displaced subjectivities, not just as the legal categories connected to citizen, non-citizen, but to diversify them within and to include the citizens who are marginalized and who are experiencing displacement within their own urban contexts. Similar to that, it becomes important to differentiate between displacement as a geographical movement, as moving from one place to the other, because that's not exceptional. A lot of groups move from one place to the other who are not displaced, right? But we have to understand it instead as a socioeconomic process, as a process of deprivation and taking away of resources, as a process that forces people perhaps to move or not move, but it creates the conditions and dislodges them from the places and the context where they're in. So the process of displacement, like Rob Nixon argues in Slow Violence, can happen while you're in your home place, and then through forces of climate change, say, or processes of other forms of deprivation, the place that you are in is no longer inhabitable or livable. And so you are displaced, even in that case, without moving from one place to the next. And similarly, Hock and Mirifta introduced this idea of citizenship in wait, which refers like the waiting process that displaced people experience while waiting for legal recognition, while waiting for certain processes to go through, while waiting for residencies and papers, and in situ displacement, which is an experience maybe in a lot of informal settlements, where people are in their context, but they are displaced and continuously having to wait for the state to intervene to provide services and to provide other forms of And they called for like a blurring between the space of the camp and the space of the informal settlement as such, because these processes are quite similar. And we have to ontologically blur the two so that we don't think of them as pieces of like a particular form of exception, but we can see the connections between the two, and hence also the solidarities that could exist between displaced citizens and non-citizens. I'm going to stop here to check for any questions.
I'm sorry, maybe I didn't really understand the first one, the differentiation between spatial movement and socio-economic process.
Yeah.
Could you develop a bit more what you
Yeah,
mean with socio-economic process?
Yeah, and so this is from Zoraster, a Sudanese anthropologist, who argues that often people exceptionalize this idea of people, of displaced people who move from one place to the next. And he was doing a lot of research on internally displaced people, actually, people displaced from the same national context. And he says it's not the spatial movement that's the most significant aspect of displacement, because migrants move, nomadic groups move, people who, so a lot of groups move, but it's not in itself this movement that is defined as a vulnerability. The vulnerability is that people sometimes move because they're pushed to move through processes of socioeconomic deprivation. And so their resources and abilities to maintain their lives are taken away, and their cherished values, their cultures are discriminated against. And so by the socioeconomic process, this is what's at the heart of displacement. It's not just the movement, it's the fact that you are rendered through a socioeconomic process is unable to maintain a way of life that's true to you and to your community. Any other questions? And so, I just ended the last slide on the notion that there are possibilities of solidarities between displaced citizens and non-citizens. And so here I want to explore this notion of weird alliances that comes from Lancioni and Simone, who say that despite whatever hegemonic ordering ensues, there remain strange alliances among all these elements: materials, buildings, designs, bodies, voices, and choreographies. And so they're trying to articulate how there are alliances that emerge that are not necessarily like a negotiation where people sit and they agree and they're aligned, but in the struggle kind of housing, for example, or in the struggle of trying to find an access space, there are alliances that emerge of people who have similar conditions of precarity and similar aspirations, let's say. And it's not just spoken between people, but also the urban space is complicit in this. So it's the buildings, it's the designs, it's the choreographies of like how to create a house here, how to create this form of geography, right? And so they say, these alliances, they propose something. They create a proposition in the urban. And this proposition is weird. Why is it weird? Because the people who have made it, who have claimed it, who have tried to produce these forms of urbanity and these forms of housing, are also sometimes self-described as weird. This is from Lancioni's research in Bucharest, I believe, with homeless drug users and built tunnels under the ground and to do all of that. But it's also about the idea of people who are otherized in a certain sense, and spatial practices that are otherized in a spatial sense. And so when these alliances emerge, they are otherwise way of creating housing or creating urbanity. And so it's because of this strangeness, they argue, that they are able to be inventive enough to create things beyond the traditional canon of what does it mean to be in a city, what does it mean to have a house, what does it mean to find a home at a certain way. And so it's an inventiveness and a style of creating forms of knowledge that are not normative, that are not already recognized as such, right? And very important that they argue that this weirdness should not be romanticized. This is not a call to romanticize like existing, inhabiting the uninhabitable or dwelling in liminality. It's a way. It's a way to the weirdness, and recognizing the weirdness is a way to maintain the tension with it, and not to make it into like some form of like a line from subjugation to liberation. No, it's a negotiation in between the two. Right? Of course.
Because you dive very deep into this element of the weird alliance, but the first time that I heard the notion from you and diving specifically into the Brussels context, because also you in your paper I think you also mentioned that they are not weird because of the unlikeliness of the people that they bring together. So you focus on specific different part. But I have used what you have said to also say that it's the unlikeliness of the actors that it brings together. It also can be characterized as a weird alliance in the sense of actors and institutions and non-institutions collaborate among them very often in very concealed ways, and they create loopholes.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also a weird alliance, and the knowledge that they produce and the way that they structure the city, it cannot exactly be characterized as normative or non-normative. It's this in between, but it's not grassroots, it's not institutional, it's not formal, it's not informal, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but it's this, yeah, it's this in between. So yeah, it was just a comment as reading your work, and again, you dwell a lot into what Antoine and Simone say, that they are weird because we produce things that we're not ready to face and we don't know how to look at.
Yeah.
But I think they're also weird, or the way that I first understood the notion is they're also weird because they bring together things that we would never expect to go together, or they bring things together in unexpected ways.
Yes.
And again, it's very, for me, it's very specific in the context of Brussels and how the city functions and how it constantly contradicts itself in its institutional processes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in that paper I speak about the institutional setups as well. So like what does it mean when you navigate between the local level and federal level and try to like claim a bit of claim through certain collaborations that might not be immediately likely to people. Yes. And that's why in my final research what I'm doing is I'm mapping displaced housing geographies, so the spaces that were in the circles that we spoke about, but I'm also mapping displaced housing alliances and weird alliances. So how are these places made possible? Who are the people who needed to meet each other or find each other or negotiate with each other to create them as such? How am I doing on time?
If you could like 15 minutes.
Okay.
You
And so just to recap what I was just saying, what I've tried to do is to connect the border.
Sorry, you have more than one. The process is so big. So you have like half an hour.
Is to connect the border and urban displacement, so people displaced across the border, we having something in common with people displaced within it, but also to connect the camp and the informal settlement. And these are framings that come from Southern urban theory that I'm then applying in the European context by looking at the camp as the reception system and the informal settlements as all these so-called alternative spaces. But then when we blend these two together and we look at housing beyond, when we look at it beyond migrant illegality and housing informality, we realize that actually even the formal how responses to displacement experience very short temporalities. They're constantly being, in Belgium for example, constantly the reception centers are being shut down and then like built back up. And so there's this temporality that may be similar to the squat at the same time. And we learned that, yeah, people move in between them and experience similar conditions, differentiated but similar. And so I'm going to skip some parts. I think I was too ambitious. I don't know how much I could cover. But the idea, what I was going to do is I was going to introduce to you, I've done field work in Athens, Brussels, and Berlin, where I was looking for these displaced housing geographies and displaced housing alliances. And I was going to give you a glimpse into each of the three cities. But for the interest of time, as we have more time to discuss, we can ask some questions about it in the discussion. I'm just going to focus on Brussels now. But if you want to ask me about Berlin and Athens, I'm happy to do so. Okay, and so in Brussels, one of the key sites that I have tried to investigate in the PhD is the squat of Palais de Loire. Has anyone here heard of it or was a part of it? No? Okay. So Palais de Loire was a squat that was in Schaerbeek in Brussels, not far from the North Station. And actually not far also from the Brussels campus of Leuven architecture, just down the street from it. And it was a squad that brought together, it started spontaneously, where a small group of asylum seekers who the federal government of Belgium had the legal responsibility to house them in reception centers because they have applied for asylum and hence they should be able to claim protection, but they were not housed. So UNHCR estimates some 3,000 homeless recognized asylum seekers who were in Brussels around that time. It was a real crisis of homelessness for people who should be protected. Right? Everyone should be protected from it, but particularly had legal obligations to protect. And so it started spontaneously. It was winter, and a small group of asylum seekers, this is an empty building, found their way into the building and were living there. But it slowly grew into much larger numbers and in the end housed around 1,000 homeless people who are, some of them are asylum seekers, some of them are maybe undocumented migrants, some of them are citizens but were experiencing homelessness. So it became this patchwork of multiple different communities that coexisted within this building. I think the context within which it exists is very important. If we go back to see an asylum like a city, this is the northern quarter of Brussels, a place that on the right you see a picture of Place Royale, which is the line from the palace in Laken of the king all the way to the palace in the city center. And so it was a route that the king used to take to go downtown, and just very close to the Ministry of Colonies that he used to work in, right? And so this Place Royale, along it there are a lot of abandoned buildings now, because it was mostly villas of a certain caliber, right? And along this line, there were actually a lot of historical sites of squatting, of housing struggles, because there were a lot of abandoned buildings by this time. So there's the 1, 2, 3, I should say this in French, the Royal, the church at Kiso. So along this line, there are actually a lot of squats and housing struggles that happened there, connected and not connected to migration. Similarly, this is the place where the Manhattan Plan in Brussels was taking place, where some 15,000 people were displaced, mostly migrants, who were displaced from there to make way to build the World Trade Center towers in Brussels. It was envisioned as the Manhattan of Brussels. And so it was a mass wave of displacing migrants in order to make way for this new liberal project of a certain thing. It's also where Maximilian Park existed. Has anyone heard of Maximilian Park and what happened to it? So Maximilian Park was a site where a lot of displaced people who wanted to apply for asylum but were not allowed to at some point occupied it in a tent camp, and then from there on, there was a lot of citizen solidarity from all over Brussels. A lot of people came to provide support and services, and it was a site for struggle for the housing rights of displaced people in the city. And so this context is important because it connects this specific moment to a broader history, and sometimes explains why certain struggles can exist in certain neighborhoods or spaces but not in others. Because these histories are also like past forms of negotiation that may have expanded the space for something to emerge in the future. And so this is the building of Palais de Droit. It used to be a tax office from the government, and then they sold it in a like sale and then lease back agreement. So we sell it to you, but we're going to lease it back. And then they occupied it for a little bit. Yes. So they occupied it for a little bit, but they continued to pay the rent of like 2.7 million euros that was paid without occupation. So a lot of money was like put into this abandoned building that was sitting there. And then in September 2022, other developers wanted to buy it, and they wanted to make it into like mixed-use, co-living housing units for young professionals. And then at this juncture, the building is occupied. And I think Palais de Droit really supports the arguments of Sioni and Simone that we can't romanticize a lot of these contexts, right? It was plagued by a lot of diseases and violence, and there was a lot of like contestation happening within this space. Some of it is also externally imposed on it, where suddenly this relegation of being unhygienic or out of control as a spokesperson of the government and evoke more than the real conditions within the context, which was all of these things, but sometimes that's also used as a way to like this credit or this value what the groups of people who were inhabiting the space were trying to do. They were trying to find housing. A lot of them, it was the responsibility of certain bodies to provide it to them, they didn't. And then I think it's important to read it, even if it's without romanticizing it, as that, as like the reach to create something by ourselves that was, it's an answer to a crisis, and it's an invention of, this is an empty building, maybe some people should be there. And actually, because of their presence, the social housing company ended up buying the building, so it came back to public ownership, and now it's being renovated to accommodate Ukrainian refugees, but none of the groups that actually occupied it to begin with. A lot of